My guest today is Winnie Yeung of Edmonton, author of Home's A Refugee Story, published by Freehand Books. Winnie Yeung wrote the book in partnership with the hero and storyteller of this nonfiction account of life in war-torn Syria, Abu Bakr al Rabeeah. Home's A Refugee Story won the Trade Nonfiction Award at the 2019 Alberta Publishing Book Awards. It was shortlisted for CBC's 2019 Canada Reads and was on the shortlist for the Governor-General's Literary Award for Nonfiction, as well as the Shaugnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Recently, it was announced that Renegade Arts and Entertainment has secured the rights to produce Homes as a graphic novel. Winnie, welcome to Book Talk on Alberta Reads.
So excited to talk.
Do you remember the first time that you met Abu Bakr al Rabeeah?
Maybe not the exact first time, because as his teacher in his grade 9 year, I feel like we had lots of little moments here and there. But I definitely remember my first impression of this lovely young man who was both quiet and shy, but also joyful and just bubbling over with this enthusiasm for learning English. So as his English as a second language teacher, or ESL teacher, I had the absolute privilege of having one-on-one lessons with Abu Bakr in his grade 9 year. And it was actually through these lessons that this little side project of ours came about.
And I imagine that's a somewhat more complex and layered story in telling us the point at which you realize you had to write Bakr's story.
Well, honestly, it kind of started off as a project where a teacher was trying to trick her student into speaking more. Because with all of our students who are learning English, the difficulty is to get them to speak a lot, which, normally teenagers, you have to get them to stop talking. But for our English language learners, it was just getting them confident enough to speak the English. And so one of the things that I always did with my classes, with my students, was I would pull a conversation card and ask a conversation, and everyone would take turns answering. And it just so happened that in my one-on-one session with Carr, I pulled out a card that said, "What is the secret wish that you have?" And right away, he answers, "I want to be a soccer player, like Ronaldo." And of course, that's what most of the kids answer, right? It's either Ronaldo or they want to be a hockey player. So I was like, okay, that's great, but what else? And that's when he got really quiet and even a little bit shy, and he thought about it and he said, "I want to share my story." And so for me, I was like, okay, that's perfect. That is the hook to get him to talk. And so I said, okay, Bakr, let's do a side project, okay? You want to share your story. Why don't we talk at lunchtime after school? You tell me all about your life in Syria, and I will write it up for you, and that's how you can share your story. So this little project actually started out as him wanting to write a speech, well, wanting to tell his story so that I could write a speech for him that he would work on memorizing so that he could give to his fellow grade 9 students at Highlands Junior High.
And it went on from there.
And it went on from there. Yes. Well, in very typical manner of me, I bit off more than I could chew. I thought it was going to be like, a little 3-page speech that I was going to write for my student. And I ended up interviewing Bakr for roughly 3 months. And then the little speech turned into a short story, turned into a book that I ended up self-publishing only because I wanted to physically hand him a copy of his story. And it kind of took off from there, and I submitted it to Freehand Books over the summer vacation, and we were lucky enough to get picked up by Freehand, and the rest is, well, actually, it's not really history, because it required a lot of re-interviewing and rewriting and working with editors and everything, and then it became a part of our history together.
And it's still going on.
Yes.
Home's A Refugee Story has, at the heart of it, a family. and the love and the faith that sustains that family through unimaginable hardship and terror. How involved was Bakar's family in helping to tell Bakar's story?
My goodness, the Al Rabeeah family, I feel like they've been so gracious in sharing their story with us. So they were in a way, involved from the very first moments when Bakar and I decided to do this little side project, because I told him, okay, Bakar, this is a big thing that we're about to do, right? Understanding that when you're talking about your past, it could trigger, trauma, it could trigger a lot of stress and everything. So I told him, I want you to go home and I want you to speak to your parents. I want you to speak to your family and see first, do you have permission? Mm-hmm. That was really important. And then once they talked about it and they said, yes, absolutely. They couldn't actually believe that anyone wanted to hear about their story, but they're saying, yes, absolutely. If you want to do this, Bakar, go for it, right? And so Bakar and his father actually sat down together and they came up with a list of 20 odd events that he could tell me about their life, starting in Iraq and then moving to Syria and finally moving to Edmonton, of all places. And so from the beginning, they were involved. In the later stages of the initial interviews, I actually had a translator come in, and Bakar came in with his parents for the very first time on a weekend at school with myself and my principal, and we spent the entire afternoon talking. And they were, in their own way, able to add little details or little side stories that Bakar didn't even know about, So for example, I love that moment when he was talking about flying the kites in Damascus, and these boys, this pack of cousins, thought they're being so sneaking around building kites behind all the adults' back. Well, mom revealed, we knew, and mom revealed that, she would leave behind little rice bags or little materials because she knew that the boys need something to preoccupy themselves. And so it was really lovely that way. When Freehand Books picked up the manuscript, they actually gave me some time, quite a bit of time, to go back and re-interview the family. And because everyone's English had a year and a half to grow since the initial interviews, we were actually able to talk in a much more natural way. There was less translating. And so in that way, Abu Bakar's sisters and brothers, they really kind of added their own zest and personality to the freehand version of the book. Whereas, as you put it, throughout the first self-published version and the freehand version, Bakar is very much the star, the hero. But I am really, really proud with how we were able to integrate the sisters' point of view and what happened to them, and everyone else's versions of stories as well, because Abu Bakr, although he was great at storytelling, first of all, it was often through Google Translate. So especially in the beginning, Abu Bakar's English was so very basic. He could just say the most basic of English words, being only 6 months in Edmonton. And so a lot of our interviews were quiet, really, because he would be typing something on his phone into Google Translate, and then he'd turn it over to me, and, well, what translation services are often like. You read the English and it's all garbled and you're like, this makes no sense. And so I'd be like, Abu Bakr, this is English, but it doesn't make any sense. So we'd have to, act things out. We'd have to look at images online for a lot of things like weapons. He didn't even know what the words were in Arabic, never mind in English. And so we spent a lot of time looking for what he was trying to tell me so that we can get through the story that way. So it was a very different way of interviewing a subject in order to get their story out from them.
Well, you certainly anticipated my next question, or where I was going, because when I read the book, it is so intimate, really, the level of detail, the level of personal insight into what was going on at the moment and what was going on among different family members. I mean, those are very nuanced things to talk about. And people that have got serious language challenges are going to have a hard time discussing that sort of thing. So yeah, I was very curious how you managed to get to that level of such an intimate portrait of these people.
again, I think it's because I got to spend so much time with everyone, Abu Bakr especially, the most time. And, you know, oftentimes, because again, the English itself was such a barrier. So I would watch how he told it, you know, even like, for example, you know, when we're talking and sometimes we're holding things back, there's tension right here, or the way that they would joke with each other in Arabic and tease each other. Like those were, I guess, the emotional details that me observing them interact with each other. Like that's what I tried really hard to put into the book to make them come to life, because I didn't want their story to be impeded by their inability to speak to me in an open, detailed way, right? And in terms of details, his mother and his sisters were very, very helpful because, you know, Abu Bakr, as wonderful of a storyteller as he is, was at the end of the day like a teenage boy, right? And if you talk to teenagers and you ask them, you know, oh, what did you do in school today? Nothing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what happened? There was a car bomb, right? So it was like, hey, I needed to, I figured out, I guess, interviewing skills and how to ask them questions in order to draw the details out. And I think when you say the word insight, you know, I love that because I don't know if that's often a word that we attach to teenagers. But Bakr himself was incredibly insightful, and I was able to bring some of the, you know, more philosophical talks that we would have into the writing.
You know, when the story begins, Abu Bakr is only 10 years old, and civil war has just erupted in Syria. The family has left Iraq, frankly, in part because of the violence and even sectarian hatred they encountered in Iraq, because the family's Sunni and they're surrounded by a Shia majority, and tensions were very high at that time. And then they go to Syria, and of all the cities they could have possibly settled in, they settle in one of the centers of the rebellion battle in the city of Homs. And for a 10-year-old boy to go through that, from time to time there is a maturity of awareness, and there's an insight, as we've spoken, that comes out of Bakr that seems old for his years. I mean, I'm tempted to ask you, did this actually reflect the premature adultness of the boy, or did you creatively add some of that perspective?
A couple of different things. First of all, I think Bakar's spirit that I think is so much in this book is a testament to his father, right? I view Habib, his father, as this gentle, quiet tower of strength for Bakr and for his family. And I found that father-son relationship so moving and so inspiring.
We should all
and
have
so,
such a father.
oh, you know, so loving and patient, but also teasing and jovial and firm, right? And so part of that maturity that Bakr has throughout is definitely because of how his father took the time to explain the world to him, to his 10-year-old son, as best as humanly possible, right? And refocusing on their family values of peace, of acceptance, of love, and everything like that. That I think has a lot to do with Hobbit, and this man amazes me. By the time that Bakr was actually reflecting on these experiences, although he told me it was the first time he was really talking about these events to someone like he was with me, he had, you know, those few years to kind of really, I guess, consider it, right? Whereas if I was talking to 10-year-old Bakr as was happening, he would have had a much more 10-year-old type reaction.
Sure.
And even then, he shared those kinds of things, like, you know, he's angry that he can't go play with his friends. He's angry that he has a curfew suddenly. So those are in there. But I also think that Bakr himself just as a human being, whether or not it was influenced by how facing civil war matures you really quickly. This is also a 14-year-old who loved Arabic poetry, and he would bring me these Arabic poems and we'd have it translated, and he would try to get me to understand what was going on in his head in terms of the internal struggle that he was having, especially in coming to grips with what was going on in the world versus what he was taught as how a good Muslim should behave, for example. And so when I was writing his speeches for him, because once the book became public, we were going and giving public speaking engagements, and I had to write all his speeches. I always sat him down and I said, okay, Bakar, what do you want people of Canada to know? And he would say these things, and I would get a lot of insight into where his emotional heart was at, and I worked those kind of more philosophical wonderings that he was having as a 15-year-old into the places where it seemed to fit as a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old. So it was a little bit of both, which creative nonfiction is beautiful in the way that it allows us to kind of conflate.
It often accesses the truth even better than just a dry account of what happened. Yes.
Exactly.
Some of the terrifying incidents and good fortune at surviving them that accompanies Abu Bakr's family, reading it seems straight out of a Hollywood movie sometimes. I'm thinking, well, here's one scene in particular, and it comes right near the end of the story, almost near the end. The family has been through all of these traumas, and they finally decided they need to leave Iraq, and they start the long process of refugee applications, and it turns out that they're finally they're accepted by Canada, and they're given tickets to jump on a plane and make the trip, and they're at the airport, I believe, or they're leaving for the airport. I can't remember quite which in my mind at the moment, but they're confronted at that moment by the Shabiya, which is the gangster-style militia, the thugs loyal to Bashar al-Assad. And it's an utterly heart-stopping moment after all they've been through. And for me, it underscored that the story really is a case of the truth being stranger than fiction.
Yes, and I think, the truth of all that, I can't help but think about what Timothy Finley wrote in The Wars about how there's something extraordinary about the ordinary. And this is a family who, this was happening to them. And the things that happened to them were horrible and to us, Hollywood movie-esque. And yet it was in that moment amongst everyone else living in Syria, it was so ordinary. And if you think about it, there were no gruesome deaths. There were, that they personally experienced, that other people had much more traumatic experiences. And yet, through all of the darkness, all of the difficult things that they had to survive through, they wear themselves with such grace, like their demeanor about how, yes, these are the horrible things that happened to us. We're lucky that other much more horrible traumatic things didn't happen to us, but they didn't ever let it hold them down, right? They kept on moving past it. And there's something extraordinary about how they kind of normalized everything and moved on, right? And I think that's part of the incredible grace and strength of this family. And what I'm so inspired by is their resiliency. They didn't, they could have taken all these, oh my gosh, Hollywood movie-like moments like car bombs and jawbones and massacres and just lived in that moment of terror and melodrama. But for them, it was just like, no, we can't keep it from us living our lives. They're horrible, people died, but we keep going. And I think there's something that we can all learn from that, and, that we can all, especially given the crazy world that we live in today, it's something quite extraordinary to me.
We could all use that lesson in grace, under fire or under pressure. Um,
Exactly.
if I can be forgiven for wandering back to Hollywood movies for just a moment, as I read this book, I found myself thinking, well, the scene after scene that happens, like, my God, this would be one hell of a movie. I'd be sitting on the edge of my seat through most of it. Are there any plans or thoughts of this story becoming a movie?
No, not currently, although we are happily accepting offers. um, Currently, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned movie because right now I'm working on the graphic novel adaptation with Renegade Arts, and I'm finding as I'm writing that script, it's just like writing a storyboard for a movie. And so it's
Mhm.
forcing me to look at Bakar's story through yet a different lens, a very, very visual lens. And I'm literally thinking of camera shots and close-ups and things like that. So it would be really interesting. The other project that I'm working on is a stage adaptation for Holmes as well. And again, looking at Bakar's story through a completely different lens where it's driven by dialogue has been really, really interesting. And, ultimately, I go back to his initial wish, and he wanted to share his story, right? And I think there's something so lovely about that because it's not that he wanted to share this is the cool stuff that happened to me. Where this came from was this young boy's wish to feel more connected to his classmates because he wanted to share a story because he understood that at that time, especially in 2015, his classmates, his teachers even, knew so little about what was going on in Syria, why there was a civil war, why there's refugees of any sorts. And so he wanted to share with them what was happening so that he wouldn't feel so alone, so that they could understand him. And that idea of stories being bridges and building community and helping us understand each other more, I think that's beautiful. And, in the different ways, whether it's the creative nonfiction book or a graphic novel or a stage play or a movie, I think the more that we can help people understand the newcomers in Canada, it would be a good thing for us all, especially given, the Islamophobia that's happening recently and very, very close to home. I think the idea of sharing out why we're more alike than we're different is a very, very strong and wonderful thing.
I could not agree more. How is Abu Bakr al Rabeeah today? I mean, he was invited to join us today for the interview, but I get the impression that he's wearied a little bit of all the media attention and the media interviews, and he took a polite pass. But how is he generally? How's he doing?
Oh, wonderfully, just like any other, young man of early 20s, and he didn't join today because A, he's working, B, it's Eid, so they're busy, and C, also, like, you're right, neither one of us imagined that we'd be doing interviews and there'd be so many different iterations of Holmes and the love and support that we've gotten from people and the interest. We never ever imagined it. So, in the beginning, we were just kind of overwhelmed and kind of going, okay, let's do this. And when I kind of sat him down and I said, okay, well, let's dream really, really big and let's think about where this could go. It's funny that you mentioned movie because one of the first things he said was, is this going to be a movie? And I was like, I don't think so, but we can try for it if you want to. And then his second thing was, do I get to meet the Prime Minister? And I was like, oh, kiddo, I'm going to try really hard to get you to meet the Prime Minister, but I don't know.
Might happen, yeah.
Anyway, no, not yet, but he did get to sit at the Prime Minister's desk in the House of Commons there. So that was exciting for him. So yeah, he's just happy 20-something. He's finished upgrading for high school. As many of our ESL students often have to spend extra time catching up and everything
Sure.
like that. caught up, and so he's looking ahead to maybe college. He's always been interested in helping people, and he's always been interested in politics. So he's eyeing political science, but I warned him. I'm like, there's a lot of reading, and he's like, oh, miss, I don't know, miss. So it's exciting.
Well, you get used to it. Take a little bit at a time.
Exactly.
This is a small book. It's about 200 pages long, but my goodness, it's cast a big shadow in its short life of three years or so. And I'm just wondering at this stage, have you heard enough back from people who have read the book, and have they told you what it meant to them?
Yes. And it's especially a joy to see Abu Bakr interacting with people who have read the book. Again, going back to his wish, wanting to share his story and him being able to talk to people who have read it and been impacted by his story, I think is such an uplifting and hopeful thing for him. I know that even for myself, like I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents came here in the early 70s. And even in writing the story, and, I heard echoes of my parents' own immigrant stories, my grandparents, and how they, came to Canada and felt disconnected. And in being able to, travel around Canada and talk to people about the book and everything, lots of people were just saying, it didn't matter where they're from. I talked to immigrants who were Chilean political prisoners, or Vietnamese boat people, or people who came over during in Yugoslavia, the Bosnian crisis, or people who just simply their families chose to come from America or Germany, and they all kind of connected to that feeling of disconnected, right? About how you can feel so lonely and wanting to be a part of community, which is what I think for me it was very instructive about writing Bakr's story, because there's almost this immigrant fairy tale that exists in our Canadian minds where we think, okay, when people have made it here to Canada, they're safe, it's easy, done and dusted, happily ever after. But we don't realize how difficult it is for newcomers and how hard it is to try to integrate into a neighborhood, into a classroom, into a new workplace. And it's not just the language, and it's not just that kind of sense of culture shock. You want to reach out and extend, but you still feel so lonely. And writing that part of the Abu Bakr story kind of reminded me about the importance of being able to reach out and help each other become a community, regardless of how long we've been here. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more. uh, if I may say, Winnie, you write very well.
thank you.
And above all, you have an ability to let less say more, and to keep the text, to keep the storyline uncluttered and driven by the natural evolution of the story. Home's A Refugee Story is your first book. I have to ask, will there be others? Have you got the bug?
Yeah, definitely. If anything, I feel like writers, or maybe it's just me, I lacked so much confidence in my writing, but having done a Abu Bakr story, it's made me a more confident writer. And I definitely want to keep on pushing myself. And again, working on these two other adaptations is just giving me chances and opportunities to learn from experts and to grow my own skills. And so I think once I'm done with this stunning story, I would like to try my hand at one of my own. So.
Well, that's terrific. We look forward to seeing it when it finally arrives and is in full bloom. Winnie Yeung, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing the story of Abu Bakr.
This was an absolute delight. Thank you so much.